Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to IAP2's monthly learning webinar. On behalf of IAP2 Canada, IAP2 USA, and IAP2 Australasia, we'd like to welcome everyone to today's learning webinar. And we're going to be featuring our IAP2 Canada and IAP2 USA Project of the Year Award winners. You're going to learn a lot. I had the opportunity to hear some of the presentation last week, and it's totally impressive. So as we said, you're going to be learning from the masters today, the people that have gone the extra mile in making sure that their projects are truly inclusive and truly good public participation. But before we get going, I want to hand it over to Drew, and he's going to take you through the housekeeping for today's session. So Drew, over to you, please.
Right, and this is a recorded session for one thing, which means you'll have the recording available to you for your professional development and a chance to review. And so we'll have that for you within about 24 hours, and along with other collateral material, such as some interesting links that our presenters might have for you, and any kind of articles or anything like that as well. We encourage people to take part. This is a very interactive session, and so we've got a couple of ways to do that. One of them, of course, is through our poll questions. So please take part in that, answer them as they come up. And also, if you want to make a comment, ask a question, there's two ways of doing that. One of them is to put up your hand. There's a little yellow hand icon that you can click, and if you just look at it right about there, you're going to see there's that hand icon off to on your control panel. Click on that, and we'll see it come up on our screens, and we'll open up your microphone, and you can ask your question then. Or if you're a little on the shy side, like me, you can type your question into the question box, and Amelia will break in when there's an appropriate time and ask the question for you. Either way, please take part. This is all about learning more about what's going on. Speaking of microphones, please keep your mics muted. We'll control everything to do with microphones on this end. So please keep your mics unmuted, and we will control everything on this end to make sure that we don't get any crosstalk or anything like that. So with that, I will toss it back to Amelia to get this party started.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much, Drew. And we really are very excited about today's webinar, and we sincerely hope that you will ask lots of questions. This is all about you, so that you get as much as you can from these two presentations. So please don't hesitate to ask questions or potentially make a comment as well. So we're going to start off with the Mental Health Center of Denver, or the Dahlia Project, as we've been calling it. The Dahlia Project was the IAP2 USA Core Value Award winner Project of the Year. They then subsequently went on to win the International Federation Project of the Year, and I know Dr. Prado had the opportunity to go down to Australia to receive that award. So big time congratulations to you on that. So our two speakers today are going to be Dr. Lydia Prado, who is the Vice President of Strategic Community Partnerships at the Mental Health Center of Denver. She promotes the development of prevention and early intervention strategies, the establishment of community-based partnerships, staff development and training, and transformational of traditional delivery models for work with diverse populations. The Dahlia Campus for Health and Wellbeing is the embodiment of Dr. Prado's work. She is building upon its success to pursue civic collaboration between communities, governments, universities, businesses, nonprofits, and private philanthropy. And Dr. Prado is joined by Amanda Trotston-Bloom today. Amanda is an internationally recognized consultant, master trainer, and a pioneer in the use of appreciative inquiry for high engagement. She is a principal with both the Rocky Mountain Center for Positive Change and the Corporation for Positive Change, and has worked with the cities of Boulder, Denver, and Longmont, Colorado, the Unitarian Universalist Association, and Hewlett-Packard, among others. Amanda has also written 3 books on appreciative inquiry. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to both Amanda and Lydia, and we look forward to your presentation. So Drew, can you please make sure that they've got the screen? And we're just getting that set up as we hand it over. But as I said, Please don't hesitate to ask any questions, send any comments. As Drew mentioned, you can raise your hand or just send it in the question box. And with that, we're handing it over. Amanda, Lydia, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Amelia, and thank you, Drew, also for getting us started here. We're really excited to share this story, which we feel is both a best practice and one that we learned from in the process. What we're going to cover today is give you an opportunity to discover how this project of the year facilitated grassroots support for a really controversial project in an economically distressed community of color in the Denver metropolitan area. And that's really the first part of the Dahlia story. But the second part of the Dahlia story is what happened after they opened and how we went back to talk with community members to find out what had enabled them to shift from their early, very profound skepticism to enthusiastic support for the project, and to think a little bit about how ongoing inquiry can really reinforce the good work that we do as public participation practitioners and imprint positive perceptions and help ongoing partnerships. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Lydia, who's going to tell you the first part of the story.
Okay, as Amanda said, we're both very excited to be here, and I'm very excited to be sharing something about the Dahlia story. So this is really about a neighborhood in Northeast Park Hill in Denver that is typically characterized by poverty, failing schools, stories of deprivation, and as a community would report, very negative prejudice and judgment on folks that live here. And I think the Dahlia story, really, the one I want to tell, is about community strengths. We started out with a lot of in-depth community conversations, and I got to say, overall, the goal was I wanted to be able at the end to say everybody who lives in this community of about 27,000 people had the opportunity to provide input. I went door to door. This is what you're seeing here is a community meeting. And I had asked them to remember what it was when I first showed up. And so you see some grimaces and thumbs down, because I came in saying, okay, what can we do about mental health in this community? And one of the responses I remember getting was from a block captain, you can come and talk to my group as long as you don't use the words mental health. So, from the get-go, it was a challenge. People are very aware that they're perceived negatively. We had deep conversations about inequity, about racism, about discrimination, about prejudice. And at the end of the day, it was really about deep listening. It was about perspective taking. It was about sitting in the fire long enough so that both people could, kind of be in there together, and I would say cool off together. It was very important for me to listen to those folks who were the most upset and angriest, and to include people that had not been included before. I had some of the most informed conversations from folks who live in the projects and gang leaders, for instance. And I would say, and I continue to say, no one understands the impact of early trauma and early deprivation more than the folks who are involved in gangs and or lead those gangs. I learned a lot and left with everybody who does this work should take, and I will say should or ought to consider using a frame of learning from a group of people in a community rather than what typically people do is learn about. It's a nuance, but it's a very important one. The history of a place is very important. There were history of researchers coming in and not being particularly mindful of the strengths in a community. Nonprofits have histories. The site itself had been a gem in the community, and there were feelings about what had happened there. There were feelings about the city and government that had tried to get things started that everything had fallen through. So that was something that we needed to be very appreciative of, and told me we had to be a different experience.
And before we go on to the next slide here, Drew, why don't you post the first poll that you have there?
Excellent. So that first poll question is up, and it is, given what you've heard so far, which topic do you think requires the most attention? Exploitation and inequity, food scarcity, structural racism, access to quality childhood education, access to dental care. So we're going to ask those of you that are listening to please select one of those. And we're going to be closing that poll in just a couple of seconds. So please make your choices. All right, Drew, let's close the poll and let's see what we've got. All right, so your results are exploitation and equity, 55%, food scarcity, 3%, structural racism, 32%, access to quality childhood education, 10%, access to dental care, 0. So back to you, Amanda and Lydia.
Okay, here we go.
So one of the topics that came up, regardless of whether we were addressing health to begin with or mental health, ended up being all about food and living in a food desert. Food scarcity, nutrition, what people had access to and what they did not have access to. That led to us thinking that if we were really truly going to support overall community health and well-being, we needed to develop a food pipeline of our own, which is what we intended to do. We now have an acre dedicated to an in-ground farm and a 5,400 square foot aquaponics greenhouse. So we're raising fish and produce in response to community need. We have also added a community kitchen. The top 4 challenges, health challenges are diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and high blood pressure. A kitchen also offers transmission of culture. All of these were really, really important to community members. The other conversation that was a surprising one that turned up when we talked to schools, principals, and teachers was oral health. That was the #1 reason children were missing school, and in the state of Colorado, it's the #1 disease of young children. So speaking of comprehensive health and well-being, we now have a dental clinic in our building. Another very heated conversation had to do with early childhood education. Folks in this neighborhood felt very strongly about serving their special needs children who up until this point in time have been bussed out at different sites, and they wanted to be included. They wanted to keep them at home. They wanted people to be culturally responsive. A lot of conversation about, again, this was an inequity conversation at its root, and people wanted what everybody else had because they feel, as we all should feel, that their children are deserving of the best. I've had people who have, this one woman here called me aside to apologize, saying, you probably don't remember, but we weren't very nice to you in the beginning. And I remember responding, oh, I remember. But she was talking about, we heard what you were saying, but we could not imagine that this is what you were talking about. So part of this is really about developing and sharing a collective vision. And even though that vision is shared, not everybody in this instance can imagine it. So we have to, I don't know, next time, draw it out, but really, really fall back on what it is we all want for everybody in a community. One of the messages I've heard on and on again from parents and teachers and principals is, and I will say this in every talk that I am privileged to give, is we have to start thinking of children and families and people as at promise rather than at risk. At risk is way too limiting. And when we talk about at promise, we build better, we build the best, we assume the best, and do the best by others. All in all, what really is important to the community about Dahlia and everything that it provides is they want that, their goal is that this instills a sense of community, connection, ownership, and belonging. We've been, you know, we haven't had any, everybody's amazed that we've never had anything tagged, anything stolen. The people care about this building, they take care of it, and we are serving more people than ever anticipated. The majority of the services, we have community spaces that are now booked out into April of 2018. The majority of services that are held here are community members providing services for other community members. Even in spite of the fact that we have a full array of mental health services, dental services, those are all busy spaces, but the community is owning this place, and I think it really speaks to the power of a place that's just for them and informed by them.
So, as you can hear, the Dahlia campus is an exceptional place with an even more exceptional history. I became familiar with the campus a couple of months before it opened up. The Mental Health Center of Denver had already forged a powerful and positive relationship with Northeast Park Hill neighbors, with elders in the senior housing across the street, with block leaders, with formal and informal community members, gang leaders. They had done amazing work leading up to this, and the campus was getting ready to open. And there was this huge buzz among staff members. They were excited to be part of such an exciting project and anxious to move to their new space. But the reality was that very few of the staff members, the people who were going to come and work here, had personal connections with the people they would be serving. Community outreach and engagement had really been largely coordinated by Lydia, her executive assistant, and one or two other Mental Health Center of Denver leaders. They had been really the face of the project. And we decided it was time to spread the love and reinforce the good work that had already taken place. Now, I'm an appreciative inquiry practitioner, and perhaps some of you on this webinar have studied appreciative inquiry with my partner, Barbara Lewis, and have learned that one of the most effective ways that we know to amplify success is to study it. So with this in mind, Lydia and I chose to launch an appreciative inquiry, a second wave of engagement, whose purpose would be to explore what had enabled these community members, the ones that we interviewed, to shift from a position of skepticism to support for the Dahlia campus. We were interested in hearing in community members' own words what practices had made the biggest difference for them, and to do this in a way that would help staff members that participated understand, amplify, and build upon what worked in the first wave of engagement. We wanted to build or enhance relationships between the staff and the community members, and we wanted to expand the body of knowledge about projects like this so that other community mental health providers, other consultants, other public participation practitioners could go forth and emulate what had really worked well. So how did we do it? We did a series of one-on-one interviews between staff and community members. The staff members volunteered to participate, and then we reached out to community members who also volunteered to participate. So we matched them up based on the greatest opportunity for relationship making. The staff members went out into the community, met one-on-one with these designated partners, then brought that information back again, and we met for a half a day to go through what we had learned. The interviews had been transcribed as well as recorded as well as transcribed, so both the people who did the interview and other people in the room were able to hear what had happened. And out of that group, that subgroup of co-researchers, we called them, articulated a series of short and long-term implications and next steps. Now, what did we learn? These are the 6 key themes that came out of the interviews. None of them are rocket science for those of us who do public participation work for a living. They spoke of the importance of assuaging people's fears, of telling the truth, of really listening, and not just listening, but responding to what we had heard, of honoring the elders. One of the first things Lydia did, we learned as we came back, was she'd come into the community and identified a couple of people. I think my memory, Lydia, is that together the people you met with had 80 years of history, over 80 years of history with the community, to say, what's going on here, and who do I need to talk with, and who needs to be involved in order for us to move this project forward. So honoring those elders, following through with commitments that had been made, and then really leaning into and honoring local expertise and interests, both before and after the campus opened. What you didn't see in those early photographs is that many of the programs that are offered here at Dahlia, in the teaching kitchen, in the community room, in the meetings, are run by people with local interest and expertise. Before the campus opened, Lydia sent one of the local elders out on scholarship to learn about aquaponics, and because she was interested in growing things, and she wanted her to be have the opportunity to be a full partner in the design of what happened. So this is all what we learned worked, was what we imagined might have worked. The main thing about this was that people said, this is our thing. That's the reason that we were committed when it opened, that it went from being something that was coming in from the outside to being our project, what one local philanthropist described as a neighborhood taking itself back, a neighborhood reclaiming itself. And the process that Lydia and others had used to build engagement and commitment and partnership had enabled people to look at Dahlia as their campus, their thing. In addition to finding out what had happened before that had helped people engage, we dug into what were the community's hopes and dreams for the future of Dahlia. We asked the question, if you had a magic wand and could have any 3 wishes granted to make Dahlia's programs, services, and facilities even better, what would they be? And they came back with 5 items that are listed here in orange. They wanted to see community ambassadors. They wanted to see greater staff engagement in the community. They wanted to see a staff that looked more like the Northeast Park Hill community. They wanted to lean into community expertise even more than they had so far. And for us to continue asking, to not just open, but to stay open to what people had to say and what they wanted to share. And on the right here, you see Dahlia's response to those asks that came out in that magic wand question. And these are some of the things that they've already begun to implement. Lydia, why don't you speak to pieces of that? Because you know it even closer than I do right now, just a couple things that are happening.
So we're working with our HR department, for instance, to actively recruit staff with similar cultural backgrounds. We have a director of diversity and inclusiveness, and are offering, it's an expectation that everybody who works here at Dahlia will go through that training in terms of how to work well with diverse communities. And basically, to me, the most philosophically important piece of that is to see strength in diversity. Not to see it as distracting or one more thing to deal with, but that there is you get a better product when you involve more people and more diverse perspectives. So that's a good example.
Fantastic. And now, so let's take a look in hindsight. Let's go into the rearview mirror and ask ourselves, how did IAP2 core values show up in this Dahlia initiative before, during, and after the opening? The first is core values number 1 and 2 are about actively seeking out and involving those affected by and interested in the decisions. Obviously, this was one of the most important things that Lydia and her team did, was to go out and actively reach into the community for information, for insight, and for answers about how she needed to proceed. Core value number 3, recognizing and communicating and integrating all of the participants' interests. One of the things we learned when we went back to do the research was that Lydia had a practice that she did when she'd go to town meetings. She'd poll people for information. For example, when they were trying to name the campus, she put it out there asking people what it should be called, and then she'd go away and she'd sort what she heard, and then she'd bring it back to the next town meeting and they'd see what she'd heard. and they'd narrow it down that way. So it was a completely iterative process of checking in, checking back, following through, and communicating what was happening all the way along the way. Core value number 5, she encouraged people to participate as they wished before, during, and after the construction. She never forced anybody. They were welcome to show up. If they were interested, they were encouraged to play. If they had skills to share, they were asked to share them, but they weren't forced, they weren't coerced. It was an invitational process.
So a good example of that, and we worked with our construction company and who'd never done anything like this before, but they had a trailer on site. I told them they had to be open every Friday. I was going to have office hours in the trailer. They had to have their drawings out. They had to be willing to explain what was going on, why the timing would change, what the rooms were going to be looking like. And we had community members flow through that trailer every Friday. Again, as they wished, as they came, and they did.
And I remember touring one of those, going on one of those tours when I first discovered what was happening here. And I was surrounded by people from all over the community and other parts of Denver who were just fascinated by what was happening. So core value number 6, provide information to enable meaningful participation. Again, go back to the story of the gal that she put through a scholarship program so that she could learn how to grow food the way that it was going to be grown on the campus and could participate meaningfully. And finally, core value number 7, communicate how participant input has affected decisions. I've already talked about that. So when the Dahlia campus had barely been imagined, Lydia and her colleagues knew nothing about IAP2. The first she heard about it was when I said, I think I want to nominate you for this award. And she looked at the core values and she said, we did this, oh, and we did that too. That she knew nothing about it and she had no formal training in the practice of public participation. But intuitively, she and her partners did the work that we as public participation professionals aspire to on an everyday basis. And now we see that the work was completely congruent with IAP2 values. And as remarkable as the campus itself is, we believe it's the process by which it was created that was the most remarkable part of the story. What we learned really, in Lydia's words, is that every community is unique. It's not the Dahlia campus building or the exact programming that needs to be replicated. It's the process. So as she says, keep in mind, if you've seen one at-risk community, you've seen one at-risk community. Don't generalize, go in, find out where you are, and make decisions based on that. And with that, I think we'd like to put the final poll up. Drew, if you'd put that up.
Excellent. The poll's up right now. So given what you know, what can you do consistently during CE to form successful relationships in the community? Maintain a strength-based approach, learn from versus learn about, active listening, keep a constant presence in the neighborhood, listen to and engage the most critical voices. So unfortunately, we're just asking you to select one at this point in time, but if you could please take a look and respond to that poll question, and we'll wait and see what we've got. All right, Drew, I think it's time to pull it down. So 3% think maintain a strength-based approach, 68% learn from versus learn about, 16% active listening, 5% keep a constant presence, and 8% listen to and engage the most critical voices. And I have to admit, as I was looking at this, Lydia and Amanda, I'm thinking, I want to check all of those boxes. So I'm thinking others might be thinking the same thing, but those are the results you've received.
Well, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity here.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We do have at least one question. I would encourage anybody else to send in some questions. We've got a few minutes before we head to the city of Calgary. So from Robin in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, I was I was wondering how you managed your shift in focus. You thought your project was about mental health, but you discovered that the key issues were food scarcity and dental health. So how did you manage that shift in what you were focusing on? And how did you do it with the decision makers and the funders?
Well, for me, it's about supporting overall health and well-being. And I think the literature is very clear. I tend to be more strength-based. I tend to be more on the resilient side of things. And that if you want to support individual children and families' health, you do have to think comprehensively. So anything that supports overall mental health and well-being could be part of the picture. It's, again, a much broader umbrella. So we know much more about how oral health affects, physical health affects mental health. To me, it made a lot of sense that unless you have good nutrition and develop healthy brains developing in young children, that is fundamental to everybody's overall mental health and well-being. So when it's kind of like you use that large umbrella, and I could make just about everything fit. And it was all about being informed again by the community about and the question was, what would support you and your family doing the best you can do? To me, that's a mental health conversation. That's how I talk about it. Folks got on board because we all are beginning to understand that we are complicated human beings, and the answers to some of these larger pressing questions are also going to be complex.
Excellent. Well, you're getting bravos from the audience. And Susan asked, did you encounter barriers from leadership or decision makers to support your engagement process? And if so, how did you overcome these?
Yes, at the beginning, people felt it was going to take too long. And basically, I asked and encouraged people to take a risk here. It's kind of like, look, nobody has done this before. Again, I gathered all the research I can to make my argument. I will also always argue for practice-based evidence. So there's a lot of evidence that when people are involved in decision making, when they're involved in program development, those are the projects that work. Those are the projects that are sustainable over time. So I just came in, I'm a researcher by training, with the research, with community conversations, with all kinds of I made the best case possible and convinced folks essentially that in the end, this is what would work. And I won the day. I guess I'm pretty stubborn and persistent. If that's, good character to this kind of work.
Stubbornness and persistent. Yeah, we'll add those to the character traits. This is a good thing. So Valerie just asked a question, and I think it follows very closely to the ones you've just responded to, but how important was the support from your sponsors to your methodology and processes? And Amanda, you might also want to jump in on that. So how important was the support from your sponsors to your methodology and processes?
I would say that what was most important in the development of this site was the fact that community members were showing up to participate in the conversations, regardless. I mean, we met at the police station, we met in homes, we met in community neighborhood coalition sites, and that helped. If you're talking about sponsors, I don't know if that's programmatic sponsors, organizational sponsors, funders, the fact that we were getting information and conversations going that hadn't happened before was something that folks were interested in supporting, especially when I started putting it all together in a way that I could actually draw out and made sense in terms of course this would of course this would be healthy for a community. No wonder this is an issue. We haven't had that. You put all the pieces together and kind of craft a picture that is connected, and again, makes a lot more sense than just attaching to one particular risk factor. Really won the day in the end, but it was being able to demonstrate that in this community, folks were interested, were committed, we're confident that they, in fact, could get this to work with our support.
Excellent. Thank you.
And I think what I would add, Amelia, since you asked for my phase of the project, that the most important element of sponsorship for me and the work I was doing was that Lydia and I were really very aligned around what we wanted to do and how we wanted to do it. She got it right away that having the staff members conduct these community interviews was going to form new relationships. And that I think the comment she made was, there's nothing changes the way that someone sees the world quicker than a relationship. And so she was ready to give her staff members the time, and we agreed that it had to be voluntary, so that they would only go out if they were excited to go out and if they understood the benefit they would receive. So that's my answer.
Excellent. Well, Valerie, as Valerie said, this is a remarkable case study. Congratulations, and thank you for sharing it. And I couldn't have said it better. So Valerie, thank you for those words. We will come back, Amanda and Lydia, after we've heard from Calgary, but I want to give Calgary, the City of Calgary, an opportunity to talk a little bit about their Crowchild project. So Drew, I'm going to be introducing Faisal, Kirsty, and Peggy, and if you can hand over the screen to them, that would be great. So we're going to start with Faisal Laka, the Crowchild Trail Study Project Manager from an engineering perspective. Faisal has been working in transportation engineering for 12 years in the Calgary area, supporting and leading the development of new infrastructure and transportation plans from the local to the regional and scale. Faisal also has a background in global policy work, supporting accountability of global decisions, educating and mobilizing for global citizen participation, and advocating on vital issues of international peace and security, social justice, and international law with the United Nations. Kirsty is a senior public participation professional specializing in complex, controversial projects and delivering on key business results through public engagement. With 17 years in project management, strategic communications, stakeholder relations, and issues management, she has been the lead of P2 for many projects, where a key factor of success has been not to avoid the difficult discussions. She has experience in creating clear, actionable reporting on public participation progress, results, and outcomes. And Kirsty and Faisal are joined by Peggy Chan. With 15 years of experience, Peggy is a senior communication strategist who has acquired a broad range of experience in nonprofit, oil and gas, and public sectors. Peggy specializes in organizational change communications and holds a master's degree in communication studies. She is experienced in complex projects that integrate strategic communications planning and implementation with stakeholder engagement, risk communication, change management, and reputational management. Wow, quite the team. So with that, we're going to hand it over to Faisal, Peggy, and Kirsty. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Amelia, for that lovely introduction. This is Kirsty speaking. We're going to walk you through some of the behind the scenes of our Crowchild Trail Study, which is a major corridor in Calgary. Just to give you, there we go. Just to give you a roadmap, pun intended. This is what we're going to walk you through today. We're going to talk a little bit about why we were talking to the community at all about a big freeway going through their community. We're going to talk about some of the things we had to do to get the project moving, the engagement approach. Then we'll take an example just so you can see how we sort of briefly how we managed that in at least one phase, and then talk about some of the things that we achieved from it. So to get started, I will hand you over to Faisal.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll just take a couple minutes at the start to provide some context of the project. Crowchild Trail. So Crowchild Trail is a major transportation corridor in the heart of Calgary. It borders many established inner-city neighborhoods, some of which are more than 70 years old. Crowchild is also one of the two main river crossings for the west side of the entire city. Over 100,000 vehicles use Crowchild Trail to cross the river each day. It's a experiencing many challenges. While other parts of this critical piece of the city's transportation network have been upgraded, the most heavily congested portion of this roadway on either side of the river hasn't seen significant upgrades since the 1960s. Challenges with how Crowchild Trail is functioning today has ripple effects throughout our entire transportation system in Calgary. As with many established communities, one of the top challenges in Calgary is projecting significant redevelopment along the corridor. Any improvements to Crowchild Trail needed to take growth into account if investment is going to last for many years. A long-term plan for Crowchild Trail already exists, but it was last approved in 1978. In light of the projected population and employment growth and the existing operational issues, we needed to update the plan to secure funding so that upgrades to this section of the roadway can be constructed. In Calgary, we accomplished this through a series of transportation plans that are more detailed as we progress through them. In the transportation planning world, the Crowchild study was a long-term plan, typically 10 to 30 years before construction, which identifies the amount of space that we need for transportation purposes. For stakeholders, this often creates a lot of fear and anxiety, because by looking at the amount of space needed for transportation, stakeholders immediately assume that the roadway would be expanded, which means that people's homes and businesses would be at risk. In 2012, the city initiated a corridor study for the area. We developed and presented a couple of different conceptual options that showed significant impacts to homes and communities to the public at a series of open houses. The intent was to invite stakeholders to provide input based on what was presented. There was an uproar, a lot of negative media coverage. Council wrote a notice of motion for city administration to stop work on the project immediately, and were directed to develop a better process for public engagement throughout transportation. Following council direction, we started the study up again in 2014. There was significant negative legacy in the communities. For good reason, community residents were distrustful. They wanted nothing to do with us. They hadn't had a good experience in 2012, and they were worried that they might be, in their words, sacrificed for the betterment of others. They were convinced that no changes to Crowchild Trail would mean protecting their communities as is. Even though, as a project team, we knew that no change to Crowchild Trail would mean increasing problems with congestion on community streets. The wrong trips in the wrong place was a key phrase. Commuters, on the other hand, were worried that improvements to Crowchild Trail to the benefit of what they saw as the greater good, that is to say, the vast number of people commuting from suburb communities and neighboring towns, would be further delayed because of opposition from community residents. This is the classic, I would say, us against them kind of mentality. So we needed to acknowledge that 2012 hadn't gone well, and we needed citizens to be a part of the solution if we were going to improve not just Crowchild Trail, but the situation with stakeholders as well.
Thanks, Faisal. Hi, everyone. I'm Peggy. I was the communications lead for Crowchild Trail study. Now that we know a little bit more about the context, I'm going to describe here some of the analysis and approach we took in order to move forward from the stop sign of no. The project team determined early on to acknowledge the 2012 study and apologize for the previous process. We could have said, you know, we're new, it wasn't us, it was somebody else, but we knew that for our stakeholders that really didn't matter. So we took ownership and faced it head on. We told our stakeholders that we learned from 2012 and we're doing things differently. And we were quickly put to the test. At our first series of engagement sessions, we heard from stakeholders that they did not receive project information mailed to their home, so we adapted. We changed our approach and did things differently. We redesigned our notices. And you can see that on the screen. On the left-hand side was the original, it's in blue. And then the middle graphic is the redesigned invitation that we sent out. Made changes to help them stand out in the mail. And as the study progressed, we continued to adapt our key messages and project materials, which you'll see on the right-hand side, to remind stakeholders and Calgarians at large of how we're doing things differently, that we're working with them and that their input was influencing decisions throughout the study. Another strategy that we took to move forward was we started to identify community values and have stakeholder conversations based on values fairly early on in the process. This is grounded in IAP2's core value of recognizing the needs and interests of all participants, including decision makers. For example, we heard early on that those who lived in established communities believed no changes to Crowchild Trail was equivalent to no changes to their communities. We also heard from stakeholders that reducing shortcutting traffic in their community was important. So we started having conversations about how no changes to Crowchild Trail would increase traffic in their neighborhood streets. If Crowchild Trail stays the same, drivers would look for alternate routes through bordering communities in order to avoid congestion on Crowchild Trail. And since this contradicts with the community's interest to reduce shortcutting traffic, we were then able to identify this as a common interest and have dialogues with stakeholders about how changes to Crowchild Trail could help communities maintain or enhance values that are important to them. By taking this approach, we were able to find the words to have conversations that resonated with stakeholders. One of the challenges with these types of technical projects is that stakeholder input is often filtered through the technical lenses of subject matter experts, in our case, transportation engineers. In this study, we decided to shine a light on how that filtering process works. At in-person workshops, transportation engineers and participants work together to explore ideas for improving Crowchild Trail. Stakeholders were encouraged to share their ideas, for example, build a tunnel for Crowchild, and the engineer would share their knowledge about what that idea might look like, the considerations and the implications. This also allowed the engineer to have a conversation with stakeholders about why they think their idea would improve Crowchild Trail and better understand the underlying issues or problems the stakeholders wanted to address. For example, in our case, the idea of burying the roadway, encasing in a tunnel, the things that people were looking for was to reduce impact to properties. Through these workshops, we were able to provide participants with the information they needed to participate in a meaningful way. This openness to share technical knowledge and real-time conversations between stakeholders and technical staff not only helped provide participants the information they needed to participate, but also helped to recognize and communicate the needs and interests of participants, including decision makers. In our case, the transportation engineers. Finally, we used an existing map-based tool in an innovative way and created an online project library to share information about the study. The story map, which you see on your left, was developed in response to misinformation or perceptions of Crowchild Trail's historical relationship with bordering communities and its historical role within Calgary's transportation network. On the right, you see a screen capture of our project library. The project library housed all of our study information, including previous transportation plans and summaries of engagement activities and verbatim reports for the study. This was done to further support our project team's commitment to transparency. Thanks, Peggy, for walking us through all of that. This is Kirsty here, and now I'll talk a little more specifically about the engagement and what that process looked like. Apologies, we're having most technical difficulties in here. So one of the things that we had heard from stakeholders very early on is that they wanted to be engaged throughout the process. As Peggy talked about with our workshops, that was about understanding the decisions as they happened. And as we know, decision making on a project happens all along the project timeline. It isn't something that happens right at the end. Long before a vote in front of City Council, decisions are made about what we're trying to accomplish, what ideas might help us accomplish them, which ideas are the best ideas, what does that look like to put all the individual ideas together into a concept, then which concept is best. And I'm illustrating all of those because this is a graphic that we use. The top one is our process graphic about how the phases built on each other, and the bottom one was our shorthand promise to stakeholders that the public's contribution would influence decisions. So we opened up all of those types of questions for public input, and it was an exceedingly important part of rebuilding trust and earning credibility with stakeholders in the adjacent communities, but also with road users from further away. The project deliverables of each phase were a sum, the input of stakeholders plus the input from the project team. We designed engagement techniques that ran concurrently in each phase that were in person, on site, or online. These techniques were aimed at any interested participants. But we also held invite-only meetings for directly impacted stakeholders, residents, businesses immediately adjacent to Crowchild, and large institutions along the corridor, such as hospitals and universities, who depend on the corridor for staff and patron accessibility to their facilities. Holding invite-only sessions was a bit risky given the sensitivities of stakeholders feeling they might be excluded from the engagement process, but it was imperative to isolate the unique concerns of these stakeholders from the public discourse in order to have a more nuanced understanding of the considerations we needed to be aware of. Recognizing that these stakeholders were facing different and more direct impacts, these sessions were held in advance of the public sessions, but with the same materials and general format. In the end, these sessions helped all of our stakeholders feel we were treating stakeholders fairly. That is based on the feedback we heard at in-person sessions and on comments some of these stakeholders made to City Council when the study went before them for approval. The Crowchild Trail study was not a disjointed conversation with stakeholders. Each phase built on the phase before it, and each phase started with a recap of where we had last left participants and an idea where this phase would lead to next. And in aligning with core value number 5, Crowchild Trail started right with asking participants in the form of an engagement process design team to help us define how we were going to engage throughout this process. We conducted briefings in advance of engagement sessions with all members of the project team in attendance and debriefings at the end of each event. We also encouraged our participants to fill in evaluation forms at every session about the engagement process. In this way, we could constantly adapt and respond to emerging issues or to gaps in the process that could be improved either for the next event or for the next phase. Each phase of engagement was a back and forth dialogue with stakeholders because, just like Core Value 7 says, we wanted to communicate to participants how their input affected the decision. As important as it was for the project team's technical experts to hear the perspectives and ideas of citizens, it was as important that participants could hear the implications, the constraints, benefits, impacts, and trade-offs of those ideas from our subject matter experts. It was imperative not only that we explained how we used what we heard, but also how we assessed what we heard, and when we couldn't use the input, why we couldn't. What you are looking at on your screen there are some of the communication materials we used to show our assessment to stakeholders. On the one side, we literally used the language that we use to evaluate ideas, constraints, trade-offs to convey the project team's initial review of the idea. A little further along, once we were talking about concepts on the right there, What you are looking at in red, green, and yellow is the flow of traffic. So that way we were able to show them how we were assessing how much an idea might improve traffic flow. So a big piece of our success, I would say the biggest piece of our success on Crowchild, is that we worked very closely as a team. Peggy, Faisal, and I spent a lot of time working together about how to integrate these three aspects of the project. So we're going to show you just a brief example from phase 3 of our project about what that looked like. So in phase 3, we were brainstorming ideas for possible improvements to Crowchild Trail and then rating those ideas against goals we had established with citizens in phase 2. We heard a ton of ideas, 500 unique ideas, but many of those ideas we heard more than once. Some of them were small-scale operational changes, such as lane reversals and turn restrictions, all the way up to large-scale rebuilding, like burying Crowchild in a tunnel, or elevating it into a 2-level highway. This particular idea that's highlighted in the blue speech bubble on the screen is about burying Crowchild, and we'll show you how that was an idea we heard from the stakeholder input, how we reviewed it, and then how we communicated what the results of that review were.
Okay, so the technical team reviewed each of those ideas for feasibility against engineering standards, legislation, and the degree to which the idea, if implemented, will improve Crowchild Trail. This is an example of a display board used at in-person events. It shows how we received the idea and how we communicated our technical findings with visuals to help participants understand factors that affected our decisions. The picture on the bottom shows the sheer size of the machine needed to construct a tunnel. That's 1/4 of the width we needed if the idea was implemented. The text boxes explained our analysis in the same categories stakeholders used to provide input, and explained why ideas did not move forward, the key takeaway of the idea, and I think most importantly, how the intent of the idea is realized through other ideas or options.
And after all of that analysis, we needed to share with stakeholders how we decided on which ideas were moving forward to the concept development phase and which ones were not. This matrix was one such way where we showed the interaction between stakeholder input, which is on the vertical axis, and the project team's technical analysis, which is on the horizontal axis. The idea for burying Crowchild is highlighted by the blue circle in the top right of the matrix, which shows that although the public said the idea meets the project's key principles, the technical analysis tells us that the idea would have required high effort to implement, and that there were a number of other ideas that would accomplish similar benefits for less effort.
We had many difficult conversations with Calgarians, none more so than with Calgarians whose homes and businesses were identified as being impacted by the final plans. I'm most appreciative of the passion and enthusiasm Calgarians have shown as the study progressed, and for the many constructive and respectful discussions and conversations over the last couple of years. We may not have always agreed, but I hope that we have fostered an understanding of how we arrived at the final recommendations. The short-term recommendations themselves will significantly improve the function of Crowchild Trail and achieve a key stakeholder sentiment to, quote, fix the bridge. They will also include modest improvements to pathway connections to the Bow River pathway system, addition of noise walls along Crowchild adjacent to residential properties, and improvements to several transit bus stops. The plan could be implemented, and in fact is now will be implemented over the next 3 years. As funding becomes available over the next 10 to 30 years, the mid to long-term plans can be implemented for even more significant improvement to the functioning of Crowchild Trail.
Through our communications efforts, which ranged from targeting specific stakeholders through tactics like direct mail, to reaching as broadly across Calgary as possible through tactics like bridge banners and media partnerships, participants from 89 communities across Calgary plus 4 communities outside of Calgary were represented at in-person events. And by the end of the 6th phase study, we have had over 3,400 attendees at 115 in-person events and close to 29,000 submissions through 9 online opportunities. Our communications effort was essential for carrying out one of the core values, core value number 4, which is to seek out and facilitate the involvement of those affected or interested in a decision.
As we concluded phase 6, the majority of participants told us that the investment we made together in the study process helped us rebuild and foster community and stakeholder relationships and generate a new plan for Crowchild Trail that balances their perspectives. If you look at how the comments from participants on our evaluations changed over time, you can definitely see the change in sentiment from skepticism to trust. Participants told us they could see how public input was used throughout each phase of the study, or how the intent of ideas and concepts brought forward was recognized and achieved by the final recommendations. So that's us today, squeaking in under the wire. It was tough getting 2.5 years of work down to 20 minutes of a presentation. So if you'd like more information about it, please visit us here to see our video that summarizes the process. And I think Drew can send out that link a little later. So that's us. Thank you for listening.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciated the in-depth look. And yes, we know it's difficult to cram everything into 20 minutes, but certainly we will be providing everyone on the call with the PowerPoint presentations as well as all of the other information that you've shared. But I've got a couple of questions for you. And one of them is, what training did the engineers, and I'm going to add planners in there, get to work with stakeholders? So Miles, thanks for that comment. So how did you bring your subject matter experts into this process? Did they back off, or were they looking forward to it, or how did all of that happen?
It's an interesting question. As an engineer and leading this project, our natural inclination is to fix the problem that's presented to us. I think one of the learning processes that was imparted to all of our team, both on the technical and the quote-unquote non-technical side, was instead of trying to fix the problem, we were trying to understand what the correct solutions were for the project. That wasn't always the right answer, if I say that as an engineer. But in developing solutions, what helped us is to start understanding why things are important or why things aren't important, and then trying to balance that off with some of the technical constraints or opportunities that came out of many of the ideas that we heard. I hope that answers the question.
It does. Was there anything in particular you did? Like, did you work with them? Did you run them through the questions? Anything in specific that you did to help them show how they could work with the public as they were moving forward on that, Faisal?
Absolutely. This is Kirsty here. We did briefings with all of the staff, both the engagement experts in the room and the technical experts in the room, and we did a briefing in advance of the sessions to go over where we were at in the study process with them, what our objectives for the engagement sessions were. We had then again briefings on the day so that we could tell them about any emerging issues we had heard about and things they were likely to hear, and to remind them that our approach wasn't so much what you should do, our approach was what that means is. And then we would follow up with a debrief at the end of every session so that we could talk about how that went and any improvements we could make for next time.
Thank you. Thank you. And do you feel that their attitude changed over time?
This technical team was always pretty good about being willing to hear, but certainly at the beginning I heard feedback from them at the end of sessions that that was a new approach for them, but that they found it valuable. I don't know, Faisal, did they say anything differently when the engagement person wasn't in the room?
No, that sums it up quite well. Like I said, we're accustomed to traditionally fixing problems, but not understanding what the actual issues are. So this was a learning process, but yeah, we had a pretty high-performing team all around. So trying different things and taking a different approach to many of our issues that came up on the project was actually where we benefited the most.
Excellent, thank you. So a couple more questions. Has the success of the Crowchild Trail study changed administration's appreciation for early and frequent stakeholder engagement and communication?
I don't know about administration as a whole, but it has certainly reverberated through the transportation department. I've seen it already on projects affecting some of the approach we've been taking, for sure on other corridor studies, but even other types of transportation planning studies.
Thanks. And I know you talked a little bit earlier in that 2012 was not a great year as everything sort of fell apart, and certainly with your decision makers as well as all of the people in and around the corridor. What would you say about today, both from your decision makers and the people in the corridor?
From our decision makers, hopefully this isn't too simplistic, but in 2012, the vote of, we have 15 members of council, and the vote was 0 for, 15 against. And when we took this plan to council in May of this year, it was a vote of 15 for and 0 against. So I would say certainly this process had the support of our city council, our decision makers at that level, and our stakeholders were well, they were delightfully frank when we weren't meeting their needs, but they were equally frank when we were. So we got a lot of positive feedback as we turned the corner and were better meeting their needs for what they wanted out of this study.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I have a question now, I think, for Lydia and Amanda, but certainly to Faisal and Kirsty and Peggy, please don't hesitate to jump in as well. So the question's from Stephen. You said that the IAP2 core values were only recognized after the process, but are there any other IAP2 resources that you now newly appreciate? So Lydia, I think this one is for you, or Amanda? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm going to let Lydia answer that one because I knew about IAP2 when I came in to Dahlia, but she didn't know about it when she started it. So that's an interesting question.
I would say that what I appreciate about it is that it really helps organize and put a structure on a process that I was not, again, as Amanda was saying, I was not familiar with at the beginning. And it's very, very nice to consider what happened throughout the Dahlia process and the research that Amanda did afterward, to consider all of those tools, like tools that you have in your on your tool belt, rather than just kind of free-forming it and being a little bit random about it. Again, I appreciate it because I think I can be more mindful about exactly what I'm doing and why. And I do believe that having a structure and being able to, the other thing that it does is that it helps me convey to other folks who want to do this kind of work what it is that does work. You know, you break it down and you're able to convey the information, and it's something that can be taught and appreciated. So those are the pieces that now, you know, I kind of, it's like, wow, it would have been great if I had known about that ahead of time, but I will be happy to use it moving forward.
And as I listened, Amelia, I realized there was one other thing I could add, and that is that when Lydia and I first met, and when I first met the Dahlia campus, the whole conversation was really around the campus itself, the amazing campus itself, the beautiful space, the amazing services that were provided. But when I went to nominate Dahlia for the IAP2 award, there was this slideshow that Lydia's team had since developed, and it was called Public Participation on the Dahlia Campus. And it felt almost as if we had given language to something. We had created sort of an awareness and an understanding of aspects of the project that would have gone under the radar otherwise. So that was the other thing that was important here.
Excellent. Lost my, and hopefully we've Drew, can you hear me okay?
You're having connection problems. You're breaking up some.
Drew, could you ask the question, please?
Can you all hear me? And so, now we've just lost Amelia's microphone. So let's just do a quick check around. Peggy or Kirsty, can one of you speak, please? Gad.
Hi, everyone. So sorry about this. We are definitely having problems with our audio at the moment. So sincerely apologize, but I really, really want to thank the Denver Mental Health Center, the Dahlia Center, and certainly the city of gratefully appreciate you presenting everything that you've done today. And with that, I think I'm going to draw it to a lose our audio connection. But just before we do that, Kirsty or Faisal, any comments?
Just thanks for having us, and we really appreciate the opportunity to show off some of the work. It took a small army to make Crow Child Trail happen. We're just the pretty faces. So thanks for letting us share the work that the city did. It was a great project and great people.
Thanks so much. I think we've lost everybody, and so thank you. And we'll talk to you soon. Take care, everyone. Bye now.